welcome to Spotlights. This is the podcast for the Yale Forum on Religion and Ecology. I'm your host, Sam Mickey, and this week I'm happy to welcome onto the show Christina Conklin. Christina, welcome.
Thank you so much.
So, for anybody who isn't familiar with you already, you're a artist, a writer, activist, doing work in and around the Bay Area. You live in Half Moon Bay, so you're one of my Bay Area connections. We met, geez, must have been like 5 or 6 years ago,
Yeah, yeah,
and uh, and have connected a little bit and worked together on some stuff that you were doing, an exhibition at University of San Francisco, and
yeah.
so always like hearing about the stuff that you're into. And before we get into some of the specific projects that you have coming out soon, I want to hear a little bit about what it's like being an artist, right, who's trying to deal with the kind of cultural, spiritual, and environmental transformation that's happening right now. So what's your road into this? How did without having to tell your whole life story, give us a little
Right.
sense.
Um, well, I think I grew up Unitarian Universalist, so activism has been a big part of my life forever, and my environmental consciousness, I think, actually it goes back quite a ways. My home church in Portland, Oregon, had a seventh generation group, which was our environmental group, but back in the 70s, and so there's always been an awareness there, um, and and I think yeah, I just became more aware, about 10, 15 years ago, maybe like many people, more aware of the environmental crisis. Went back to graduate school, studied fine arts, and really found myself drawn to this contemplative space that both science and spirituality share, where you're sort of in the observer mind, really trying to understand the how and why of things, and ended up creating a lot of work that had to do with natural processes and um, the revelation that nature is. So I would pour concentrated salt water on the floor for 4 days, and it would evaporate into these crystalline maps, and um, walk up riverbeds and see what there are all kinds of strange things that were happening to the detritus that had been embedded in layers of sediment over time. And so a lot of inquiries that kind of were walking that line between science and spirituality and activism. So the show where I met you at University of San Francisco was um, called Worlds in the Making: New Ecological Rituals, and it was um, the idea that about a personal encounter with our own responsibility for our place within climate change, and the university as an institution as well. So we co-led a walk that took people on a little journey around the campus to think about um, all those interconnections, and yeah, so I do a lot of participation work now too,
Hmm.
because I really want to engage the public and have interesting conversations with folks like you.
Nice. That's great. I like how ritual comes into all that as well, because I think it's obviously one of the big challenges of our time, right, is coming up with like new narratives and new stories to help understand who we are. But those narratives and stories don't hit home so much if you don't have rituals and practices to kind of really embody it.
It's
And then
really a
art is,
challenge of our time. Yeah.
you're right,
Yeah.
right at that kind of interface.
Right.
Uh,
And I think that became more difficult again with the joys of COVID, because I think, I was developing a lot of in person, guided walks and interactive installations, and the idea of engagement became very, very different in the past year. And I think a lot of people are still trying to figure it out. There are ways to do it, and I'm still working on that myself. Yeah, how do we deeply engage across electrons?
Yeah, right. How do you have any? any tips for us? Because I know I know we're all struggling with that, and especially people who are interested in ecological stuff. But really everybody, if you're trying to do art or teaching or any kind of communication, the online world is so alienating, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
But especially for ecological stuff and for artistic participation. So, if you have any tips at all.
Well, I'll mention one experience I had that has really stayed with me. There's a group in the East Bay called Service Space, and they've been going for 20 years, and they're all about the gift economy and how do we understand multiple forms of wealth and like all of our gifts and become basically more fully human and less enraptured by the almighty dollar. And so they have these wonderful short courses called laddership pods. They're sort of a leadership, but peer led leadership um, little seminars. And they created a really deep experience through like daily journaling and responding to each other's journal entries, and then a weekly call. And it was actually a very simple kind of curriculum structure that really got me thinking about how to build like the strong connections with people who are thousands of miles away. And again, and I'm also involved in this as Global Regeneration Collab, which is again an online network of people who are doing very deep work where they are. And it's a space for us to kind of gather and reflect and share and meet occasionally. And I think it is possible. It is possible to create community online, and I think a lot of it comes down to intention
Mm.
and authenticity. And there's a lot of webinars out there, but in terms of creating actual community, I think it is possible, and that's I think what I'm interested in looking at doing next.
Nice. That's
Mhm.
great. Those are great examples. And yeah, the tension is a big part of it, right? Because webinars, it's a different kind of scene. It's like we're just here. Here's a speaker,
Yeah,
and you don't even really know who else is in your Zoom room or whatever.
yeah,
So yeah, there are. If the intention is to come together, and especially when you're sharing these kind of ecological practices or thinking about the gift economy, like this is the basic material conditions of our life.
yeah.
So that's the common ground we share can be our literal common ground.
Right, right. And I'm just, yeah, I would love to explore that more. Just how do you build genuine community in a digital space? And I think some people are doing it well.
Yeah, and probably something we're going to have to continue doing in the future, as
Yeah,
environmental crises aren't going to stop anytime soon. So
right.
it's good to kind of work on these practices for community building while we
And I
can.
think, yeah, I'm that since writing, I recently completed this book on climate change in the ocean. It's called The Atlas of Disappearing Places: Our Coasts and Oceans in the Climate Crisis. So that's very focused on the climate crisis and as it affects the oceans and coastal communities and urban planning and agriculture and all these different related areas. But when I was doing the research for that, I really began to understand how deeply interconnected. I mean, we know this, right? But but you keep learning it at deeper levels.
Yeah.
I feel um, that they're the systems, like the fundamental systems of um, our economy and our ecology and our society and culture. They're so fragile and contingent the way we've built them. And what was really a wake up call for me was the Stockholm Resilience Center has Johan Rockström is a climate scientist there, and he developed a theory of 9 planetary thresholds about the zone of safe existence for life on Earth, and climate change is only one of them. And when I realized that, and it's actually not the one we're in the greatest danger right now. The nitrogen phosphorus thresholds are actually
Hmm.
far worse in planetary balance. So anyway, this is a long way of saying um, I'm pivoting from sort of a straight up climate change space toward this more, there are people working on this greater planetary emergency space that's actually looking at the relationships between all of these different social and ecological and political thresholds that we're navigating right now. And
Right.
yeah, so the Club of Rome is working on planetary emergency these days, and this Global Regeneration Collab is in doing a lot of interesting things. So I feel like I'm all for the climate folks, you know, go climate. And we need to also step out of our silos and not think that if we solve one little piece of this enormous complex puzzle that we're going to be okay.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's a really important point. Yeah, because it is a tendency, especially I don't know, the last 10 years as climate change has become more and more of a topic and more of a focus of environmentalists. And then people start to think that that's like the issue. And they
Yeah,
forget like, no, there's kind of a lot of problems, sadly, and they're all connected and you can't just solve them all by solving one of them. Like
yeah,
just pulling the carbon out of the air isn't going to fix our relationship to nitrogen and to phosphorus and to toxins and pollutants. And
yes, yes.
yeah, I appreciate that a lot because I don't know, I love studying climate change and talking about it and working with people who are in that area. But I do have, you know, a tendency to be like, oh, whoops, I forgot there are there are
Well,
other
the pandemic
issues.
was a great wake up call for that, right? Because it was sort of, it felt like it came out of left field for some folks, and other folks were like, you know, they've been talking about this for decades. And then to watch the cascading impacts of how it affected, you know, uh, economies and you know, education and food security, and how, you know, this one little, it started little, you know, and then it became huge, but one pushing it one place on this complex web um, created cascading impacts throughout the entire world, and that's going to be more and more the case more frequently. So it's just, I think it's good to put all of it in that kind of biggest possible context, even though it becomes unwieldy. You got to look at reality in the eye. You know, there's not a lot of use in pretending.
Well, and that seems like one of the really important roles that art has is precisely to kind of provide that lens that allows people to kind of hold this because it's just too much. You know, if you're just reading people who are talking about all these planetary crises and just facts and facts and facts, is very overwhelming. There's just too much for any person to bear. And then art provides, you know, some context for people to feel and to think and to act individually and in a community because it's a shared experience.
Hmm.
Um, I'm wondering if, you know, I want to hear more about this book, The Atlas of Disappearing Places, which is a beautiful title. It's very haunting. So it seems appropriate to our moment for sure. So I'm curious what, you know, what's the book about? What's in there? What kind of, is it research plus art going on?
Yeah, so it's a lot of research. My co-author, Marina Psaros, she works on the kind of urban planning and climate communications side of things. I'm more of, I would say, the artist, philosopher, ecology person. And we teamed up, and the book is 20 short portraits of different places around the world as they're being impacted by a particular aspect of climate change in the ocean. So, for instance, in Houston, it's hurricanes and the toxic pollution of all of the petrochemical plants in and around that area, and the social justice implications of that. Um, in the North Atlantic, I look at ocean warming and what that's doing to the plankton food web. Because it's not, this book is not, for me, the important thing about the book is that it's not anthropocentric, right? That of course, there are lots of implications for human culture, mostly because we built cities in the wrong places. But
Right.
but the ocean is a system, and it's magnificent. It's so complex and infinite, and learning about the microorganisms and the biology was really profound, and was also a reminder, like, we come from the ocean, right? We cannot abandon it. It is literally the lifeblood of life. And so learning about the deep sea, and what's happening in the Arctic, and um, it was really important to me to get those other pieces in. There's a chapter on deoxygenation of the ocean in the Arabian Sea, which apparently deoxygenation is the biggest problem nobody's talking about.
Hmm.
And so these portraits of each place, there's a little story about sort of how that place is doing right now, what the challenges that it's facing. And then we actually look back from the year 2050, and we say what happened. We just write the story of what happened next. And it was a fun way to both research what are the advances that are happening now that, like, could provide some, hope and problem solving in a very practical sense, and also to imagine, like, what are the choices we're going to make as a culture? Are we going to choose well or poorly? And we tried to paint pretty um, pragmatic but optimistic futures, to show what is possible. I'm not a dystopian person. Um, but it's a big climb. We got a big climb, and because the way climate change works, so much of the damage is already baked in. We can slow down the pace of change, and we can do, smart urban planning and protect biodiversity, and there's a lot we can do. And then there's some things that are just going to keep happening. The storms are going to get stronger. There will be more refugees. How are we going to think and plan wisely for the things that we do know are going to happen?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, the refugee crisis. Yeah, I think that's something people are conveniently not talking about, and then when it gets worse, we're going to see some pretty severe authoritarian kind of policies and the
Yeah.
xenophobia, and yeah, that's just terrifying. Yeah, I wasn't sure when you said, looking back from 2050. I'm like dystopian looking back.
No, this is the thing. I mean, we're going to be there before we know it, right?
Yeah.
I'm 52. I mean, this is a few years away, and it's when my children will be adults, and it is the day after tomorrow. And if you think, I guess I've spent a lot of time thinking about our geologic time, and, like, layers of the earth and things like this, but this is the snap of a finger in climate and planetary um, context. And so we just have to, it right now is about waking up. And I think that's where, religious traditions have such an important role to play, because we just need to find the stories that get us to wake up. And every religion's got traditions, prophetic traditions, and rituals and things that we just have to find an interfaith dialogue and a cultural conversation that is, inclusive um, and awake.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me, right when the Buddha was first teaching, and people are like, what's the thing? Are you a guru? He's like, no. And they're like, are you this or that? He's like, no. Like, well, what are you? He's like, I'm awake. I woke up. So then they call me the awakened one. Buddha just means awake, and it's like
Yeah.
that's just this one little skill, just wake up,
Whew.
and it just blows people's minds. Like, what? How did you do that? Like,
Yeah.
well, just pay attention and some stuff like some really simple kinds of things, but when you do them, the world shows up and you're awake, and then you're awake to so much suffering.
Yes.
But you're also awake to the possibilities that you can alleviate that suffering, that you can respond to it, you can make the world a better place. So
Right. Yeah.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the deoxygenation problem. I feel like I just heard about this recently, and of course, ocean acidification we hear
Right.
about, and it
Yes.
seems maybe connected, but also sounds terrifying because you lose oxygen. Obviously, this is a severe problem.
Yes. So it's really just physics, right? This is that warm water absorbs less oxygen. And when water absorbs less oxygen, it also stratifies. So it becomes the ocean is built of this, like, I think of it as this really beautiful, complex, three-dimensional weaving, because it's in layers, and some of the layers are only like a few millimeters thick, and they have different temperatures and chemical compositions, and it's so far from being this kind of big bowl of water that we imagine, right? So there's the wind layers, and then there's the deep ocean currents, and so it's this, I think of it as this, like I said, this complex weaving. And it when warm water doesn't absorb as much oxygen, it stratifies more, so the layers are not mixing, and it's where the layers mix that life is most abundant. So that's where predation happens, um, and every night the plankton of the world follow the moon up to the surface and feed, and then go back down to the deeper ocean because they can't handle sunlight. But there's this giant, the biggest migration on Earth happens every single night, as the plankton comes up to the surface to feed. And so there are really all these remarkable ways of understanding the ocean that bring it to life in a way that we just haven't taken the time to do. I mean, Rachel Carson, of course, was
Right.
primarily an ocean writer and wrote beautifully about all these processes. And then there have been, documentaries, and David Attenborough and other wonderful filmmakers. But I think it behooves us to really understand that there's, the ocean is 71% of the Earth's surface, and it averages a mile deep, um, the whole ocean. And there's a lot going on in there.
Yeah,
So
and speaking of, trying to avoid anthropocentrism, right? It's like, well, it's the reason we focus so much on land. It's like that's where we live.
right. Exactly.
So we're like, no, this is where all the important stuff is happening. Couldn't
Yeah.
possibly be anything interesting out there. And like, no, it turns out there's a lot going on.
Turned out, I mean, I guess that's, I credit my childhood on the Oregon coast, I think, because I've always just been drawn. I think there are people who are just, sort of drawn in their core being to the ocean, and I'm one of those people. And it just, feels like source of being, really, for me.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I like, the image of, the ocean as this kind of complex weaving that really brings into the imagination that it isn't just a bowl of water. Like honestly, that's kind of I know better that I know it's not just a bowl of water, but that's still kind of how I imagine it when somebody mentions the ocean. It's like, yeah, it's just a bunch of water and some,
Right, and then we
animals in the
tend to make
water.
it into a utility, right? We either use it as a road for our ships, or as a garbage can, or as a grocery store for the fish, or we just use it, and we're using it up. And it's the same on land as well. But I think because it's not visible, we it's easier to discount what's going on there.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it reminds me of this book by Kimberly Patton called "The Sea Can Wash Away All Evils," and it was
Ooh.
about it's a phrase that they used in ancient Greek societies because it was basically whatever problem you got, dump it in the ocean,
Dump it in the
and
ocean.
takes it to this magical place called away, right?
Away.
And you throw
Mhm.
it away, and at a certain point, we're like, oh, apparently, no, the sea cannot wash away all of our evils. It's kind of maxed out at this point, and we're starting to realize that there's no away. Um,
There's no way. And a lot of the carbon in the atmosphere, it's the ocean is actually very slow to absorb carbon. and it's about a 30-year lag,
Mm.
so that what's in the atmosphere now will only show up in the ocean in about 30 years. So if we stop today, if we stop producing carbon, it will continue to warm for another generation before tapering off. So that's just something we got to know is true. It's just the laws of physics, and we just need to. So when climate scientists talk about it being late in the day, and that changes are going to continue to happen and increase, that's what they're talking about. It takes the, I mean, if you think about um, the planet as a, in a sort of a Gaia sense, it is an organism, and it takes a while to metabolize all the change that we're throwing at it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's the challenge, right? Is to think at that kind of Gaian scale,
Hmm.
and to realize that we're part of that,
Yeah.
and that we're not separate from the oceans. In fact, we are the oceans. We are the planet,
Right.
and
That
I'm
was one, to me, one of the important things in writing the book, was to really um, talk about a different paradigm of the nature culture relationship, and that we are nature, and the plastic we make is also nature. Like, it is all um, part of a single system. So I think I also wrote the book to kind of, like you were saying, it's hard to keep these things top of mind. I did it to force myself to do that for 4 years. Like, if I could, make my own mind really see um, that was, it felt like a good discipline for me to be able to reframe my own vision and thinking a little bit.
And that's great because then you can pass that on to the rest of us, and then we get to use that, and so standing on the shoulders of giants kind of thing. We're like, no, I looked at a lot of this stuff really close, and like, thank you for doing that. I don't know if I could have kept going. Sometimes it's like, no, that's enough. That's enough about that place. It's too much to handle. It's so emotionally weighty. So having somebody pull this stuff together for the rest of us. I mean, Rachel Carson's books are another good example,
Yeah.
and the kind of wonder at the majesty and awe, and to have that kind of intimacy with the oceans,
Hmm.
that's hard to develop. And when you have somebody who already developed it sharing that, then it's much
Hmm.
more palatable.
Hmm. And I illustrated the book with maps of each place that I painted on dried sheets of seaweed. So this was a fun uh, practice that I came up with, which was going down to the shore and harvesting the seaweed and really feeling very connected to the cycles of the seaweed, and then yeah, harvesting it and kind of processing it and turning it into these big beautiful sheets of translucent parchment, and then painting maps on them. So yeah, each chapter is illustrated, and maybe I'll have an art exhibition or something along with the book at some point.
Very cool. Oh, that sounds great. I love the idea of seaweed parchment.
Yeah.
Pretty. That's
Well, it's
that's
really
great.
gorgeous. Yeah, it's beautiful, and it's sort of like with each of these maps, they're paired with like a Google Earth image to give you some geographical reference points, and it's sort of like the seaweed is eating the earth, which is kind of great.
That's good. The seaweed wins after all.
That's right. That's right.
Nice.
That's
That's
right.
great. And the book is coming out in July.
Yes,
And so I'll, when I have this episode up and stuff, I'll have some links so people can kind of check it out. It's never too early to pre-order.
that's right.
Sometimes
It's
people
available
think it
now.
is, but if you want the book showing up fast, you want to be one of the first who pre-ordered it.
That's right.
I'll,
Pre-ordering is good. Yeah.
Um, well, I wonder if, to kind of close out, if you could tell us, one thing that you would recommend for anybody who wants to get involved in this kind of approach to ecological thinking, right? It's not just research, it's not just spirituality, it's not just art. You're kind of weaving all this stuff together. What's something people can do, whether it's, I don't know, maybe a particular text that's a good guide, or if there's a
Hmm.
practice, what's,
Hmm.
kind of one thing for people to get more involved in this perspective?
Gosh, just one.
Just yeah, just one for
One.
now.
I guess I would say Um, Spend a lot of time in nature, for one, and then be really curious about what it is you're seeing. There are some writers who are just remarkable at awakening that sort of that sense of wonder and communion with nature. One who's coming to mind at the moment is Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Mm.
Her recent book is called Braiding Sweetgrass. She's a scientist who also is has indigenous uh, uh, heritage and has just beautiful ways of writing and thinking across that divide of science and spirituality, or wisdom and knowledge, or whatever. And she has another book called Gathering Moss, which was beautiful. Um, so she's very, she's land based. She's your land lady. And then I would turn people to Rachel Carson. She's known for Silent Spring, but really her first 3 or 4 books were all about the ocean, and they're just beautiful, and they hold up pretty well scientifically. I mean, she was writing them in the 50s and 60s, that this is super groundbreaking stuff. I mean, plate tectonics was brand new.
Right.
But and she was describing it all to people for the first time. Um, but a lot of it holds up pretty well and is also incredibly poetic. And actually, her first article ever was she was a biologist with the Fish and Wildlife Service. That was her career, and she wrote some pamphlet on the ocean that her boss said, "Hey, this is really way too good for us. You got to go publish this in the Atlantic." And so she did. And she, what is the name? It's called, I think it's called Undersea, 1937.
Mm.
And it is just so beautiful. It's not very long, but it's a really beautiful look at what is going on in the ocean itself that might inspire people to, dive further.
Nice. That's great. That's wonderful. Yeah, I love the idea that started out as a pamphlet. So it's
I
just,
know.
this is actually pretty good.
She's a beautiful writer. Yeah, yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. And that wonder ultimately can guide us through these times, I think is a really, really special message.
I would actually add one other thing on the like the harder to read side of things. Is there's a new study, and I think it's called Understanding the Possibility of Avoiding a Ghastly Future.
Hmm.
And this is on the wake up call, cold shower side of things. And it's a very recent article by 18 leading scientists and economists, and including Paul Ehrlich and a number of leading people, about the complexity of all of these interrelated crises. So biodiversity loss, population growth, resource extraction, politics, all the things we've been talking about. Um, and really to say it's, now is the time to wake up, not next year, and that this decade really is critical. And so I could point people toward that. There's a group at Stanford called the Millennium Alliance for Humanity in the Biosphere, mahb.org. And they're really looking at these fundamental challenges that we're facing as a species right now. And that's worth doing too. I think you have to do both. You have to do the loving the world that we live in, and then figuring out what we need to do to save it.
Yeah. That's great. Well said. Christina Conklin, thanks so much for coming by, for sharing your work with us, your perspective, giving us some references, some
Yeah.
reasons to hope, and some reasons to be pretty scared.
Wake up.
Wake up, wake up. It's a simple message, folks. Wake up.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank
Well,
you.
geez, I guess I'll let you go. Thanks so much for making time for us.
Yep.
And thanks to everybody for tuning in. So we'll be back next week with some more discussions for you. In the meantime, take care and be well.